Hello and welcome to Davis Foot Orthotic Solutions Continuing Education Seminars. My name is Brian Davis and today's seminar is entitled Abnormal Foot Supination, a Forefoot Varus. As a disclosure, my name is Brian Davis. I am the owner and the CEO of Davis Foot Orthotic Solutions. So let's start by talking about the foot and ankle complex. And you know, it is just that, it's complex. There's 28 bones, there's 25 joints. The feet serve as our anatomical foundation, which has very important implications to our development as well as our function. We'll see that not only is it our anatomical foundation, but it is dynamic and it changes during different functional activities. So think about developmentally. So as an individual, if our anatomical alignment or foundation is not correct, it's off, it can have significant impact on the development of all the proximal bones. Think about an individual standing with one foot on the curb and one foot off the curb. What would that mean as somebody developed over time? Pretty much develops significant changes when we talk about the development of the knees, the hip, the back, the lumbar spine, and all the way up to the cervical spine. So it's very important to have a level foundation to maximize one's developmental sequence and growth of the musculoskeletal system. When we talk about function, the foot has a great impact on our function. Yes, it's our foundation, but it's dynamic. So think about when we walk and when we run. When we walk and run, when our foot first hits the ground in the gait cycle, let's say at heel contact to foot flat, there's a tremendous amount of force that the body has to absorb. Okay, so when we're walking at a cadence of about 2 to 2.5 miles per hour, the body typically has to absorb at least 2 to 2.5 times body weight. And so the foot is our first mechanism of shock absorption. And what we'll see is that the foot will pronate. That pronation will cause a series of mechanical events that allow shock absorption to occur at the interface of the foot and the ground, but it also causes sort of a mechanical change of events up the kinetic chain, which allows for the knee and the hip to flex, which is really our second and our third mechanisms of shock absorption. So as you can see, the foot is very involved in shock absorption from a mechanical perspective. The other thing that occurs when the foot first hits the ground, as we said, the foot pronates, and we'll define that a little bit later, what that is mechanically, is that when we pronate, the foot becomes what we call a bag of bones. There's a great amount of space created within the foot-ankle complex, and clinically it really becomes a very loose pack entity, and which is important when the foot first hits the ground, particularly if we're talking about walking on unlevel terrain. When the foot becomes loose and floppy, a bag of bones type entity, that it becomes very easy to adapt to the uneven terrain, thus helping us keep our balance as well as not allowing us to injure ourselves. When we move from a pronated position of the foot at the beginning of the stance phase and progress to the remaining 2/3 of the stance phase, what we'll see is the foot will start to change position and will go into what we call foot supination. And supination means that the arch is being raised, but mechanically there's a whole chain of events that occur. Within the foot, what we'll see is the foot will become more of a rigid entity. As we know, when it hits and pronates, it becomes more of a floppy entity now, or a loose pack. Now it's becoming more of a structurally tight, rigid entity. And the reason is as we progress through our gait cycle and the foot is sort of coming off the ground, it's helping us propel ourselves very efficiently. So a more rigid foot for propulsion is more important than a floppy foot for propulsion. The other thing that the foot provides us is balance, particularly when our foot first hits the ground. As we know, we pronate, and as we know, it creates all sorts of things like shock absorption at the foot. Then it creates, or facilitates second and third mechanism, shock absorption at the knee and the hip. But what it also does is that as the foot becomes sort of a bag of bones, a floppy entity, it also lengthens and widens to its most, largest point of both entities, and that gives us our greatest base of support for balance. So the foot is very important in balance. In single leg stance, our foot's ability to move from pronation to supination becomes very important to help control our center of pressure over our very small base of support. So it's our primary mechanism of balance in single leg stance when we don't have a big displacement of gait. The other really important thing with the foot and ankle complex, when it's involved in the whole complex sequence of gait of human locomotion, is that it allows for frontal plane motion that occurring within the foot, at the rear foot and the forefoot and midfoot, and it converts the motion into more of a transverse plane motion that we'll see, transverse and sagittal plane motion that we'll see in the lower kinetic chain. So, the foot ankle complex encompasses the subtalar joint. The subtalar joint is been described as the torque converter of the lower kinetic chain. And if you've ever worked with an individual that has had, an ankle fracture, subtalar fracture, perhaps a fixation or a fusion, that you'll see that their gait is never going to be smooth again, despite what you do, despite what you restore in range of motion, that because the subtalar joint perhaps is not moving well and the towel-crawl joint is not moving well, that gait is not going to be smooth because that the torque converter has been damaged or compromised. So let's before we go any further, let's talk about the anatomical areas of the foot so we're all on the same page when we go through this presentation. So if you look at your slide, what you're going to see, the area in yellow is essentially the rear foot, also known as the subtalar joint, and that's comprised of the talus superior to the articulation to the calcaneus. When we look at the red area of the foot of this picture, that is essentially describing the midfoot or the lesser tarsus, which is the navicular, the cuneiform, and the three cuneiforms and the cuboid on the lateral side of the foot. Now the forefoot is in blue, and the forefoot typically is described as the metatarsals. When we're doing measurements of the foot and ankle, and we're trying to define the plane of the forefoot, we actually put our goniometer on the metatarsal heads. And so our forefoot is the blue area of this chart. There's also different sort of nomenclature terminology. When we talk about the forefoot, the first metatarsal is also known as the first ray, or it's part of what is called the first ray, which is the first metatarsal and the first cuneiform. The second ray is the second metatarsal and the medial or the second cuneiform. The third ray is the third metatarsal and the lateral or third cuneiform. And the fourth and fifth rays are just that. The fourth is the fourth metatarsal and the fifth ray is the fifth metatarsal. And then we have our toes and digits, and that is defined by the green color of our picture. And we know that the first toe or digit is called the hallux, and we'll talk a little bit about hallux range of motion, particularly dorsiflexion, and the importance of dorsiflexion that is involved with sort of normal gait mechanics, and how we have to make sure to measure it and assure that we establish adequate dorsiflexion for normal gait. So let's talk about the closed kinetic chain mechanics of the foot, particularly the subtalar joint. And so what you have here on this graphic analysis on your slide is a representation of the stance phase of gait. And we'll see that that goes from the heel strike, which is HS, to foot flat, from foot flat to heel off, from heel off to toe off. So you could see that we further broke down the stance phase of gait to three categories, or three subcategories, which is the contact phase, the mid-stance phase, and the propulsive phase. When we talk about the stance phase of gait, we know that the gait cycle is approximately 1 second in human locomotion. So the stance phase of gait is approximately 0.6 of 1 second of that cycle. So when we look at these subcategories, the subsections of the stance phase of gait, we're talking about 0.2 seconds for each of the categories. When you read the literature, essentially that's the way it's broken down. It's slightly different from one author to the other, or investigator to the other, but essentially that's what it is. So when you look at the graph, we'll see that there's a red line going across the center of the graph. And that actually is represented with the subtalar neutral. So when we have a line that is, whether it's deflecting down or deflecting up, anytime it intersects with the red line, the subtalar joint is in what it's called its neutral position. And the neutral position is defined when the talus and the calcaneus articulations are at its maximal contact. Okay, so when we look at this graph, we'll see that any line that deflects down is representing the movement of pronation or position of pronation, and the line that deflects upward or moving upward will represent the motion of supination or position of supination, depending on where it is on the graph. So what we see with normal subtalar mechanics or motion is that at heel strike, the foot is in slight supination. And immediately upon contact with the ground, or heel strike with the ground, the foot moves into pronation, and we'll see that maximal pronation is reached by the time the foot is on the ground, or foot flat. The forefoot is on the ground, foot flat. And typically, depending on who you read, that's about 1/3 of the stance phase of gait, or 0.2 seconds. So we're seeing it's a very quick period of time. So it happens right away, and it's important for pronation to happen. A lot of people have the concept that pronation is wrong, and part of that has to do with the commercialization of shoe wear and orthotics and things like that. But pronation is really important to exist for our bodies during the gait cycle, the running cycle, because what it does is that as the foot pronates, we talked about it a little bit earlier, the foot is going to sort of roll down and in. And when it does that, it helps absorb shock. It's like a boxer being hit by a punch and they're rolling away from it, or one of those wrestlers get thrown onto the mat and they roll with it, because it helps absorb shock over a larger area. The other thing that pronation mechanically does, and we talked about this as well, is that it creates space between all the bones in the foot. So as we pronate, the foot moves into a loose pack position, and we talked about the loose pack position allowing the foot to be adaptable to unlevel terrain, so we don't injure ourselves or lose our balance. The other thing with pronation is that it maximally lengthens and maximally widens our foot, particularly in single leg stance, by the time we're in foot flat. So we have our largest base of support, which we know the larger our base of support, the better we can balance. So it maximizes our balance when we're in single leg standing. The other sequences that occur is its impact on the lower kinetic chain, which we'll talk about on the next slide. But it sets off a series of events that allows, motion of the tib-fib complex, the knee, the femur, and the hip joint. So we see that at foot flat we reach maximal pronation. Beyond foot flat, what we see is the lines start to progress upward on our graph, and we see that the foot now is starting to go in the opposite direction of its position and function, which we will call supination, or the foot is starting to resupinate at this point in time. As we reach heel off, we just crossed over the neutral line and become slightly supinated, and as we get in from our heel off to toe off sequence of events and reach our propulsion at toe off, we'll see that the foot should be in maximal supination. Again, the mechanical sequencing that is occurring to help us with our gait or running cycle is that the foot moves from a loose back position to a closed back position. So the foot becomes more of a rigid entity, and that rigid entity helps with propulsion of our body as we translate through space.